What does the CIA actually do? We're told that they protect democracy, stop terrorism, and uphold stability, but history tells a much different story. Across the world, whenever a government has dared to put workers before capital, whenever a nation has threatened US corporate dominance, the CIA has intervened. Not through open war, but through deception, sabotage, and violence. Today, we're exposing 5 covert operations that reshaped the world in favour of US imperialism. Operations Sycamore, Chaos, Cyclone, ZR/Rifle, and Gladio. These were not accidents or isolated blunders, they were necessary interventions for the survival of capitalism. This is the Left Library, the home of simple political theory. Syria, a nation positioned at the heart of the Middle East, has long been a strategic prize. Since the Cold War, the US sought to weaken its government, one of the last remaining states that had not fallen into direct neoliberal control. Syria, while not socialist, operated under a state-controlled economy with subsidies, nationalised industries, and trade alliances with Russia and Iran, all of which obstacles to Western capital penetration. When the Arab Spring protests reached Syria in 2011, the US saw its opportunity. In 2012, the CIA launched Operation Sycamore, a covert program to train and arm Syrian opposition groups to overthrow the Assad government. The pretext was bringing democracy to Syria. The reality was a flood of US weapons and funding to sectarian fundamentalist groups, including factions that would later evolve into ISIS and recently overthrow the Assad government. This was a repetition of an old pattern. The US has a habit of funding religious reactionaries to counter nationalist or leftist governments. In Afghanistan, they did it with the Mujahideen, which we'll get to later, but in Syria, they funneled billions of dollars worth of arms, much of which ended up in jihadist hands. But the contradiction of imperialism was inescapable. While the CIA armed Sunni Islamist factions, the Pentagon was backing the Kurdish-led SDF, whose socialist, decentralized model of governance ran counter to the US client-state expectations. The result? US proxies fought each other using American weapons. While Syria's economy was one characterized by state-run industries and self-sufficiency, by the time the war ended, much of its infrastructure had been destroyed. Western sanctions prevented post-war reconstruction, ensuring that Syria remained weak. Foreign capital, particularly Turkish and Gulf-based, moved in, seizing resources and forcing privatization onto a shattered economy. What could not be achieved through regime change was now being enforced through economic strangulation. Sycamore is proof that US intervention rarely brings stability. It brings chaos, because chaos makes exploitation easier. While the US was exporting chaos abroad, it was also waging war against its own people. In the 1960s, socialism was not a foreign ideology. It was growing within the US itself. The Black Panthers, militant labour unions, socialist organisations, and anti-imperialist movements posed a real threat to the ruling class. The CIA responded with Operation Chaos, a domestic surveillance and sabotage campaign that aimed to neutralise any movement challenging capitalist hegemony. The Panthers were the most dangerous to the state, not just because they were armed, but because they were organising self-sufficiency for black and working-class communities. Fred Hampton was assassinated because his Rainbow Coalition united black, Latino, and white poor communities under a Marxist vision of class struggle. He was not just an activist, he was a threat to the ruling class. Operation Chaos paved the way for neoliberalism within the US. By the 1980s, as organised radical groups were crushed, capital could move forward unopposed, dismantling unions, cutting wages, and sending industries overseas. Before Sycamore, before 9/11, before the War on Terror, there was Operation Cyclone, where the CIA built the foundations for the modern jihadist extremism. In 1978, Afghanistan's socialist government, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA, launched sweeping land reforms, enacted women's rights policies, and nationalized key industries. It wasn't perfect, but it was a direct challenge to the feudal landlords and US imperial interests that had long reigned over Afghanistan. The US's response was to fund the most reactionary forces that were available. From 1979 to 1989, the CIA poured over $3 billion into arming and training the Mujahideen, turning tribal warlords into well-equipped jihadist militias. Who were the fighters? Many were foreign-born volunteers, including a young Osama bin Laden. The result was the birth of the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and a 40-year cycle of instability that continues to this day. The socialist government of Afghanistan had redistributed land, expanded education to all, and advanced women's rights. But after Cyclone, the Mujahideen, once in power, privatized resources, banned women from education, and ruled with a feudal economic system again. The US framed Afghanistan's war as the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The truth was that the CIA deliberately crushed a socialist movement that could have modernized the country, and still pays the price of it to this day. When coups weren't enough, the CIA turned to assassination. Operation ZR/Rifle was a covert program designed to eliminate anti-imperialist leaders who threatened US corporate interests abroad. These were not dictators nor threats to democracy. They were elected leaders who sought economic sovereignty, or economic independence. After Congo won independence from Belgium in 1960, Patrice Lumumba was determined to build an independent economy. His government sought to nationalize Congo's vast mineral resources, including uranium and cobalt, which were essential for Western industries. This was unacceptable to the US and Belgium. The CIA tried poisoning his toothpaste before orchestrating a coup that led to his torture and execution. Following this, his body was dissolved in acid to erase all traces. The result? Congo's economy was handed back to Western corporations. Trade unions in the country were crushed, and wages remained perpetually low. Mobutu Sese Seko, a staunch pro-US dictator, was installed in the country to ensure that the Congo remained a resource colony for the West. Chile, under Salvador Allende, was moving towards socialism through democracy. His government nationalized Chile's copper mines, ending US corporate exploitation over the country, expanded social programs, improving education and healthcare, and strengthened trade unions and worker cooperatives in the country. For US companies like ITT and Kennecott Copper, this was a direct threat. The CIA's Project Fubelt was launched to destabilize and overthrow Allende. Economic sabotage sent Chile into an economic crisis. Right-wing paramilitaries, funded by the CIA, then launched attacks. The military, led by Pinochet, staged a coup on September the 11th, 1973. Allende refused to surrender and was found dead in the presidential palace. Whether by suicide or execution remains debated. What followed was Pinochet privatizing Chile's economy, slashing the social programs, and cutting wages. Neoliberalism was imposed under the direction of US-trained economists for the first time, called the Chicago Boys. And over 3,000 leftists were executed, and tens of thousands were tortured. Chile, once an independent economic model, was turned into a US-controlled neoliberal experiment. Guatemala was another case where a leader challenged US corporate control. Under Jacobo Arbenez, land reforms threatened the United Fruit Company, which controlled nearly half of Guatemala's land but left it uncultivated while the population starved. Arbenez's government redistributed underused land to 500,000 peasants. He broke the US corporate monopoly over agriculture in the country and moved towards economic self-sufficiency. The United Fruit Company, with direct ties to US officials, lobbied for intervention. The CIA responded with Operation PB Success, an early ZR/rifle-linked campaign. The Guatemalan military was bribed to turn against Arbenez, and a CIA-backed coup forced him into exile. His successor reversed the land reforms and handed the economy back to US corporations. Following that, Guatemala became a dictatorship serving US agribusiness, and the working class lost its land and returned to poverty. Decades of CIA-backed military repression followed, including mass executions. Every assassination served a purpose beyond removing a leader. It ensured that a comprador bourgeoisie was installed to protect US corporate dominance. And it also ensured that neoliberal policies were forced onto these economies. Labour unions and socialist movements were crushed, preventing future resistance. ZR/rifle wasn't about removing dangerous individuals. It was about permanently securing capitalist exploitation. In the aftermath of World War II, Western Europe witnessed a significant rise in leftist movements, particularly communist parties, which had been instrumental in resisting fascism. This surge posed a perceived threat to the capitalist structures favoured by the United States and its allies. In response, NATO, with substantial involvement from the CIA and MI6, initiated Operation Gladio. This clandestine program established stay-behind armies across Western Europe, intended to act as resistance forces in the event of a Soviet invasion. However, in the absence of such invasion, these secret armies redirected their focus towards undermining leftist political entities within their own countries. Italy became a focal point of Gladio's activities. The Italian Communist Party, PCI, had garnered substantial public support, leading to concerns among Western powers about a potential shift towards socialism. To counter this, elements within Operation Gladio allegedly engaged in a strategy of tension, orchestrating violent incidents and attributing them to leftist groups to sway public opinion against them. One of the most tragic events was the Piazza Fontana bombing in 1969, where a bomb exploded at the National Agrarian Bank in Milan, resulting in 17 deaths and numerous injuries. Initial blame was placed on anarchist groups, leading to widespread arrests and a crackdown on leftist organisations. However, subsequent investigations suggested the involvement of right-wing extremists with connections to Operation Gladio. In Belgium, a series of violent attacks during the 1980s, known as the Brabant Massacres, left the nation in a state of fear. Heavily armed groups targeted supermarkets and other public places, resulting in numerous casualties. The perpetrators were never conclusively identified, leading to speculation about the involvement of Gladio operatives aiming to create instability and justify increased security measures. Operation Gladio's activities had profound political and economic repercussions. The manipulation of public perception through fear undermined trust in democratic institutions and processes. Leftist parties and organisations faced stigmatisation, legal challenges, and a decline in public support due to their alleged associations with terrorism. With leftist influence diminished, politics favouring neoliberal economic models were more readily adopted, aligning with the interests of Western capitalist nations. The exposure of Operation Gladio in the 1990s led to parliamentary inquiries in countries like Italy and Belgium. These investigations unveiled the extent of covert operations and prompted debates about the ethical implications of such clandestine interference in sovereign nations' political landscapes. The CIA does not protect democracy, it destroys it. Every operation that we've covered, from Timber Sycamore, Chaos, Cyclone, ZR Rifle, and Gladio, proves that when socialism, economic independence, or even mild social reform threatens Western capital, the CIA steps in to crush it by any means necessary. From arming jihadist forces in Syria and Afghanistan to assassinating anti-imperialist leaders in Chile and Congo, from coordinating false flag terror attacks in Europe to waging domestic surveillance and repression within the US, the pattern is clear. Whenever capitalism is threatened, imperialism responds with sabotage, terror, and violence. But these operations were not just about controlling governments, they were about controlling entire economic systems. After every intervention, neoliberalism followed. Nations that once had the potential for independent development were forced back into the Western capitalist order. Their industries were privatized, their labour unions were crushed, their resources were handed over en masse to foreign corporations. And this isn't history, it's happening now. From US interference in Latin America today to the ongoing suppression of leftist movements worldwide, the imperial playbook hasn't changed. The question is, how do we fight back? Understanding this history isn't just about knowing the past, it's about recognizing the structures of imperialism in the present. The fight against capitalism and imperialism requires organization, strategy, and class struggle. But not just in one country, but internationally. This has been the Left Library, the home of simple political theory. Thank you.